Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 1st of April 2022, which also happens to be April Fool's Day that you might have realized by now. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on this screen, and let us now begin the discussion. So the first news which we have taken up for today's discussion appears on page number 1. US Deputy NSA warns India of consequences. There will be consequences for any country, including India, that conducts local currency transactions through Russia's central bank or constructs a payment mechanism that subverts or circumvents the United States sanctions against Russia. This has been stated by American Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, Mr. Dalip Singh, who is right now visiting our country. So in the wake of economic sanctions levied by Western countries on Russia, India has adopted a path which best suits our national interest, which is going ahead with the trade transactions with Russia. And this has irked United States of America the most. Because considering itself to be superpower, it is not liking the fact that how can India adopt an autonomous and independent foreign policy. Now, if you look into the syllabus of GS paper 2 under international relations, effect of policies and politics of developed countries on India's interests is a part of your syllabus. And being one of the most developed countries across the globe, the policies of US have a lot of impact not just on all countries but also on India. Now, whenever we have analyzed India's relation with other countries, we have focused on the divergences and convergences. Convergences are those factors or those phenomena which ultimately bring the countries together, their common interests. For example, economy, energy, partnerships, security, diaspora, and collaboration. Whereas divergences are those factors which are basically unresolved issues, which stop the countries from coming as close as they should be. And so in this regard, we are going to discuss the same in case of India-US relations as well. Now, before going into convergences and divergences between India and US relation, it's always a good idea to look into some very little and brief background of India-US relations. India and US have not always this close, especially during the time of Cold War era. But India-US relations saw ascendance of relationship in 21st century, which was crystallized by 2008 Nuclear Civil Agreement, which was signed between Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and US President George W. Bush, under which India agreed to separate its civil and military nuclear facilities to place all its civil nuclear facilities under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, and in exchange, USA agreed to work toward full civil nuclear cooperation with India. That was a watershed moment. That was the first time US had given waiver or exemptions to any particular country which was not a part of Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is an export control cartel that had been formed mainly in response to India's first nuclear test in 1974. Then in the background, India was already conducting LPG reforms, liberalization, privatization and globalization, which was aligning India's economy more closely with that of capitalist form of system, which is what US likes very much. In the same period of time, we have seen ascendance or rise of China. The rise of China is not something which is of concern only for India, but has challenged the single global superpower status of US, and that in the background has brought India and USA close a lot. And then finally, we have seen increasing number of influential people belonging to Indian origin or Indian diaspora community rising up to the top levels, especially in US corporate. And all these factors working in background have ensured gradual but steady convergence between India and US relations. Apart from this, shared values of democracy, rule of law, human rights bind these two countries together. And it has resulted in a lot of areas of cooperation. Starting with economy. US is India's largest trading partner, and inbound FDI from US is in excess of around $50 billion during pre-COVID era. While Indian and US negotiators failed to forge a trade deal, they would work on a legal framework for a future deal which can become phase 1 of comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. But nonetheless, India and US are quite complementary when it comes to economic relations. While US is provider of technology and funding, India is provider of one of the most talented human resource. And this complementary is what makes India-US relationship very unique. Apart from that, when we talk about energy relationship, US and India launched strategic energy partnership in 2018 to enhance energy security and bolster strategic alignment. Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited or NPCIL and Westinghouse Electric Company are looking to finalize the techno-commercial offer for the construction of 6 nuclear reactors. At the same time, India has also started importing crude and LNG from US in last 5 to 7 years, with total imports estimated at around $6.7 billion having grown from zero, and that is a massive boost of imports from US. Not only it ensures India's energy security, but also provides US with a big market for its energy supplies. After energy comes an important element of cooperation, that is global partnership. And this has been most defining feature of partnership between the two nations. Both are a part of quadrilateral security dialogue and collaborate on forums like East Asia Summit, G20. And US has expressed interest to India's integration into G7 as well. And this has been happening in the backdrop of rising aggression of China in the region and beyond, which is seen by US and India as a common strategic challenge. Apart from that, in order to promote high quality trusted standards for global infrastructure development, India and US along with others proposed Blue Dot Network. It is an across the board certification process that aims to bring governments, the private sector and civil society together. It is seen as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Then an important area of cooperation is security. We have seen India and US sign 3 very high stake agreements, which are COMCASA or the Communication Compatibility and Security Agreement Facility Transfer of Encrypted Communication Systems, and is a key requirement for the US to share high-tech military hardware. Then India and US signed LIMOA or Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, which was signed in 2016, which gives militaries of both the nations access to each other's military facilities without making it automatic or obligatory, mostly for the purposes of refueling and replenishment. And then finally BICA or Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, which facilitates exchange of geospatial information. All these 3 security arrangements have been discussed in great detail in a DNS, as you can see, and so if you just want to know this perspective, you can go to the video and watch. Then the natural convergence between India and US comes from increasing people-to-people participation. Strength of Indian diaspora in US is around 4.5 million, which is around 1% of the population of United States of America. Indian diaspora is a source of agent of soft power in US and an effective public diplomacy tool which is acknowledged for its work ethos, discipline, non-interference and peaceful living with the locals. Apart from that, as we have discussed, Indians have risen up to the top post in one of the biggest corporate sector in US, and that is also affecting US policies towards India. And then finally, collaboration in the fields of science and tech cannot be ignored. What has not been written is university to university cooperation, which is one of the most solid bonds which we have created over past 5 decades. But apart from that, the collaboration is also materializing in between our best institutions. For example, NASA and ISRO are collaborating in space missions for carrying out joint missions. For example, the world's first dual frequency synthetic aperture satellite was supposed to be launched in 2022. We'll see it any day. Then in terms of COVID-19 as well, India and US have collaborated to ensure vaccine supply to poor nations across the world. But as we have clearly seen over past 2 to 3 years, despite n number of convergences, India and US are not confidently moving towards each other decisively. And that is because of very prominent divergences which still exist between India and US relations, which kind of make both the nations skeptical to solidify this relationship. And so it is equally important for us to discuss these divergences as well, or the differences between the two nations. Starting with the Trump era. Trump era did a lot of damage between India-US relations, starting with the trade transactionalism of USA during Trump, which was manifested in a lot of policies, but especially removal of India from its list of developing countries and taking off India from the list of beneficiary developing countries under a scheme of generalized system of preferences. Now, under the generalized system of preferences, US provides non-reciprocal duty-free treatment for certain countries for their imports into US. Since India had been beneficiary of this program, a lot of categories of goods into the US market did not attract any import duty. But as soon as India was removed from GSP, India was put on the same pedestal as developed countries, attracting equal amount of import duty, which has hurt India's exports to US by a great margin. Then, the changes into US immigration procedure done by Mr. Donald Trump also had a lot of impact on Indians. US ramped up its H-1B denials under the executive order of Buy American and Hire American. H-4 visa have also been issued at a much lower rate since then, which has impacted the number of Indians immigrating into US every year. Then an important aspect of divergence or differences is the tariff war which India and US have been playing in past 3 to 4 years. Since 2018, both countries were engaged in tariff wars. For example, in 2018, US imposed additional tariff of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum imports from various countries including India. India's refusal to remove the 20% tariff on ICT products caused the trade deal between India and US to delay, which still remains pending. Then, similar to tariff war is the issues related to World Trade Organization or WTO. India and USA are involved in WTO disputes on issues like capping of prices of medical devices by India, which US does not like, and greater Indian market access for American agriculture and dairy products, which India is not allowing. Because of which, there is a considerable difference between the two nations, especially in matters related to trade and commerce. Then comes the issue of intellectual property rights. India has been on US's priority watch list, which identifies countries posing challenges to American intellectual property rights. Also, US wants India to strengthen patent regulation and to ease the limitations American companies investing in India face in India, which India is not obliging to. And last but not the least, American policy toward Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and its withdrawal from Afghanistan have had considerable divergences between India and US. When it comes to Pakistan, US President said US relationship with Pakistan is a very good one. And in 2019, US decided to resume international military education and training program that had been central pillar of US-Pakistan military cooperation for years. When it comes to Iran, USA has put unilateral curbs on Iranian imports into India through CAATSA. That has impinged India's relation with Iran. Similar is the case with Russia. With the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, America has come down very heavily, along with other Western countries, on Russia in terms of economic sanctions. Since India has tried to escape these sanctions, these are definitely going to cause a lot of problems between India and US relations. Similarly, unilateral and untimely withdrawal of US from Afghanistan and handing over the government of Afghanistan on plate to Taliban has ruffled a lot of feathers with Indian government, which had left India totally aback because it directly impacted India's investment in Afghanistan. The next news which we have taken up appears on page number 1 as well as on page number 12. Areas under UPSC regime reduced, says Home Minister Shah. So the Union Home Ministry has considerably reduced the disturbed area within courts under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act UPSC in Assam, Manipur and Nagaland. The order will be effective from 1st of April, and this is not an April Fool's Day announcement. This is a serious one. Now, when we talk about UPSC, it's a very serious matter, not only for the country, but also from the perspective of civil services examination. UPSC, which confers special powers upon the Indian Army in disturbed areas and legitimizes basically any actions they might take in disturbed areas. The law, however, has been misinterpreted by many, and there are calls for revocation of the UPSC, whether it is warranted, misplaced, or whether it's totally unnecessary. There is hardly any law in the Indian statutory provisions. There is hardly any other law in India's history which has been as debated as UPSPA. Not just that, from the perspective of mains examination, this is very important topic. Because first and foremost, UPSPA is deployed in areas where there is an issue with the public order, where there is already high level of extremism or insurgency. And so if you look at the GS paper 3 syllabus, it gets fit into all the lines of the syllabus. We talk about challenges to internal security, when we talk about security challenges and their management in border areas, when we talk about linkages between development and spread of extremism, it is applicable everywhere. And from the perspective of civil services examination, first we have to understand the provisions of UPSPA. Why is it needed? Why are there so many protests against UPSPA for the revocation of UPSPA? And finally, is there something we can do about and maintain a right balance so that UPSPA is used in the way it was first envisaged to be? So whenever you have a recollection of UPSPA over the years, you recall several voices of protest. There was this 11-year-long fast by Ram Sharmila, the Manipur activist, demanding a repeal of the law. Even before that, in 2004, various civil society groups in Manipur launched an intense agitation after the death of Manorma Devi, a civilian who died in the custody of Assam Rifles. In 2005, following her death, the Union Home Minister visited Manipur and instituted a commission under Justice Jeevan Reddy, which also asked for the modification or repeal of UPSPA. And so similarly, there have been a lot of committees and their recommendations, and various state governments from time to time have demanded the repeal of UPSPA, or at least modification in the way it functions. And even before we delve into the provisions, it is necessary to examine the context in which UPSPA is used. During exceptional situations of internal disturbance in India, the Indian Army is called in to quell the potential and actual violence. Now, in such a context, the Army is given extraordinary powers under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now, the armed forces generally cannot be deployed against Indian citizens unless a local government or central government asks the army to intervene in a situation that the government is unable to handle. In short, the army is called in only after the local police action has failed and insurgents have gained an upper hand. The danger in such a situation is that it is possible for insurgents to take over and make a state secede from the union. This obviously is unacceptable, and so in such situations a need was felt to create an act which would have certain different powers as envisaged in various criminal procedure codes and in the Constitution of India. And that is how UPSPA, or Armed Forces Special Powers Act, came into existence. So it was enacted in 1958. That was the first time it was enacted, which grants, as we have discussed, extraordinary powers and immunity to armed forces to bring back order in disturbed areas. We will understand what this means. So moving on to the provisions. As we have seen, it provides special powers to Indian armed forces, and it empowers the governor of the state or the central government to declare any part of the state as disturbed areas, if in its opinion there exists a dangerous situation in the said area which makes it necessary to deploy armed forces in that particular region and to restore public order. Now, when state governor calls for army intervention, that seems okay, but how can central government instruct army to be deployed in a particular state? And that power comes from Article 355. So if you read Article 355, it says that the duty of the Union to protect states against external aggression and internal disturbance. It shall be the duty of Union to protect every state against external aggression and internal disturbance, and to ensure that the government of every state is carried on in accordance with the provision of the Constitution. So even if the state government is not in agreement for the deployment of armed forces, central government can basically shove an army in a particular area if the government feels that that particular area is disturbed. Now, what if a particular area is declared as disturbed area and army is deployed? What are the powers which are then given to armed forces, which have been very contentious since then? So UPSPA allows the authorized officers to open fire at any individual even if it results in the death of the individual. The armed forces get power to arrest, anyone, search any property or any person, and seize which may be necessary to restore the order in a disturbed area without the warrant. And the most problematic part of whole UPSPA is legal immunity to army. Armed forces personnel have complete legal immunity or indemnity for their actions as far as those actions were committed in disturbed areas. So you can understand that not only that UPSPA provides very wide and blanket powers to armed forces, and that is the reason that it has always been hated by the people on which it has been levied. But according to the government of India, extraordinary situations demand extraordinary measures, and that is how UPSPA is justified. Of course, the application of UPSPA has led to restoring of order in various areas. It allows for effective functioning. It is essential for armed forces to function effectively in insurgency and militancy affected areas. But the laws which exist normally in a particular area in normal situations might hinder in the way they function against terrorist organizations, against insurgents. And to empower armed forces to make them feel confident, it is important to enshrine them with such powers. At the end of the day, we have to ensure security of nation, and hence provisions of this act have played a crucial role in maintaining law and order in disturbed areas, thus protecting sovereignty and security of the nation. And then finally, we need to protect the members of armed forces. It is crucial to empower members of armed forces who constantly face threat to their lives at the hands of insurgents and militants. Its withdrawal would result in poor morale. Apart from that, you have to remember one thing, that extraordinary powers are also necessary as the armed forces face asymmetric warfare involving raids, ambushes, mines and explosive devices, even sabotage. And so it is important to empower them with such powers. But that absolutely does not mean that UPSPA has not been misused. In fact, there have been documented abuse of power. It has been alleged that immunity granted by the Act has led the armed forces to misuse the powers and commit offenses like enforced disappearances, fake encounters, and sexual assault. For example, Justice Verma Committee on Offences Against Women in Conflict Areas said UPSPA legitimizes impunity for sexual violence. Justice Santosh Hegde Committee to investigate fake encounters in Manipur described it as a symbol of oppression, and Justice Jeevan Reddy Committee recommended removal of absolute immunity under UPSPA. Then, of course, it is a threat to fundamental rights, especially when it perpetuates in a particular area for 50 years. It leads to suspension of fundamental rights and liberties guaranteed to the citizens by the Constitution, and hence weakens democracy. Human rights violations in UPSPA areas are not inquired into and followed by adequate action. Thus, it is against the principle of natural justice, because of which the credibility of Indian democracy is diminished. There are certain areas where insurgency and terrorism got bolstered as a result of UPSPA, because people's disillusionment with the democratic setup is exploited by secessionists and terror sympathizers, which leads to more violence and more counter-violence, creating a vicious cycle. Then, according to some of the people, it has proven to be ineffective. Critics argue that this act has failed in its objective of restoring normalcy in disturbed areas, although being in existence for about 50 years. And then finally, the areas which might be declared by the government as disturbed areas is beyond the judicial review, which in essence violates the basic structure to the Constitution of India. So what exactly can we do going forward? And there are 4 sets of measures which can be taken. Adherence to human rights. It needs to be emphasized that human rights compliance and operational effectiveness are not constraining requirements. In fact, adherence to human rights norms and principles strengthens the counterinsurgency capability of force. At the same time, we need robust safeguards. For example, every death caused by armed forces in a disturbed area, be it of a common person or a criminal, should be thoroughly inquired into. Then we need to remove ambiguity in the law. The terms like disturbed, dangerous, and land forces need to be clearly defined to ensure greater clarity. And finally, we need to ensure transparency. Greater transparency in communicating the status of existing cases to include its display on the Army and government's website. Proactive feedback to petitioners on actions taken by government in past human rights cases are some of the reforms which we can bring about to break this vicious cycle of counter-terrorist activity, fueling insurgency, and then again emboldening the state's response. So this topic is fairly important from the perspective of prelims examination, but there the focus would be limited only on provisions, while from the perspective of mains examination, the focus would be on merits and demerits and way forward for UPSPA. Let's now move on to the next article. The next article which we have taken up appears on page number 7 is the fuel pricing policy problematic. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the resultant supply shocks has led to increase in international crude oil prices. Since India imports around 75 to 80% of its crude oil requirements, the prices of petrol and diesel have increased drastically in last week. In the light of recent developments, this article discusses about the fuel pricing policy of the government. In this regard, there are 3 important elements which we have to discuss. The fuel pricing policy prior to 2010, post 2010, an important aspect of oil bonds. Because 2010 was the year when the petrol prices were deregulated by the UPA government. That was the first step towards deregulation of the prices, which basically meant bringing them out of the government control. So prior to 2010, government followed administered pricing mechanism for petrol and diesel. Under this mechanism, the prices of petrol and diesel were not linked to the market. Rather, the government used to provide subsidy on the petrol and diesel. Hence, the oil marketing companies were required to sell petrol and diesel in the domestic market below the price at which they might have imported it from other countries. And this meant losses for oil marketing companies. That was referred to as under-recoveries. The under-recoveries were supposed to be compensated by the government by transferring the subsidy amount directly to oil marketing companies. Then came post-2010 era. In the year 2010, the petrol prices were deregulated by the UPA government, and later in 2014, the NDA government deregulated the diesel prices as well. Hence, the prices of diesel and petrol are market determined and are fixed by oil marketing companies. But in reality, the government indirectly controls the prices of petrol and diesel. For example, in the wake of recent elections, the government ensured that the prices of petrol and diesel do not increase, in spite of increase in international crude oil prices. But when the election got over, the prices of petrol and diesel started increasing throughout the India. Now you might wonder, when the prices have already been deregulated, how is government still managing to keep the prices at a particular level? And that is because most of the oil marketing companies like HP or BPCL or IOCL, they are public sector undertakings which are ultimately controlled by the government. And so government decides the prices in these companies have to offer. And that is how government artificially controls the prices even though the market has been deregulated. Now in this regard, it is also important to talk about oil bonds. Now if you recall, prior to 2010 in case of petrol and prior to 2014 in case of diesel, the government followed administered pricing mechanism, which meant a lot of under recovery, and that losses had to be made up for by the government. And so the transfer of huge subsidy amount to the OMCs on an annual basis would have led to increase in fiscal deficit of the government. Hence, to keep fiscal deficit under control, the UPA government issued oil bonds worth rupees 1.4 lakh crores between 2005 and 2010 in the form of oil bonds. Because government did not have any money to pay these oil marketing companies for the low prices that they were keeping. Features of these oil bonds were that they were long-term government securities with maturity period ranging between 15 to 20 years. They were non-SLR status, which meant oil bonds could not be considered as G-Secs for the calculation of statutory liquidity ratio which each and every bank has to maintain. Rate of interest on these bonds ranged between 6.5 to 8.3%, marginally higher than the normal G-Secs. They were not considered to be part of fiscal deficit, but the outstanding liabilities on the oil bonds form part of public debt. These oil bonds were issued by the government to the OMCs, and so the options before oil marketing companies were that they could hold on to these bonds and earn interest till the maturity of oil bonds. Upon maturity, they would get the entire subsidy amount. Or the OMCs could sell these bonds in the secondary market to banks, insurance companies and other financial institutions and get immediate cash. But since 2010, the practice of issuing oil bonds has been put to an end. But now the problem has arisen over the debt obligation and interest payments on the oil bonds. As of September 2021, there were 1.5 lakh crore in outstanding principal and around 37,000 crore in interest yet to be repaid on these oil bonds. Hence, earlier the government had argued that it has less scope to reduce tax on petrol and diesel since it has to repay these oil bonds. So from the perspective of prelims examination, the current fuel pricing policy is important, and for that you need to understand prior to 2010, and in the same way it is important to understand the oil bonds and why there is so much of debt obligation on the government of India, because of which the government is still keeping very high taxes on diesel and petrol. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The next article which we have taken up appears on text and context page. The demand for restoring the old pension scheme. So recently, Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh government have announced the restoration of old pension scheme for government employees for the year 2022 and 23. The OPS was removed by the government in 2003 and was replaced with NPS, or National Pension System. In this regard, let us first understand about the National Pension System, and then we will move on to understand the differences between the old one and the new one. It is extremely important from the perspective of prelims examination to understand these key differences, although UPSC might not go into such a detail. So when it comes to National Pension Scheme, which is also a pension cum investment scheme to provide old age security to citizens of India. Focus here on citizens of India. Regulated by PFRDA, or Pension Fund Regulatory and Development Authority. When it comes to beneficiaries or who can join, any individual citizen of India, both resident and non-resident in the age group of 18 to 65 years. When it comes to the benefits or beneficiaries with respect to different sectors, it can be categorized into central government employees, state government employees, and private sector individuals. So all those employees of central government who joined the services on or after 2004 had no other option but to choose for new or national pension scheme. When it comes to private sector, it is applicable to both corporate as well as any individual citizen who is not a member of central or state government can join the national pension scheme. So how does it work exactly in reality? When it comes to the contribution, government employees make a monthly contribution at the rate of 10% of their salary, and a matching contribution is paid by the government. For the central government, the employer's contribution rate has been enhanced to 14% from 2019. So what happens to the deducted salary or the contribution from the employee's salary? So it is invested in certain pension funds, which in turn invest in different asset classes like government securities, shares, bonds to generate higher returns, just like mutual funds. When we talk about the returns, NPS is designed on defined contribution basis wherein the subscriber contributes to his accounts. However, there is no defined benefit that would be available at the time of exit from the system. So the defined part is only with respect to contribution and not the benefits after the retirement. The accumulated wealth depends on the contributions made and the income generated from the investment of such wealth. And that is where the state governments have started raising alarm, because you never know the kind of funds you have invested in, whether they are inflation proof or not, or how much return are they going to yield after 30 years. And that is why Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh government have resorted to old pension schemes. So of course it begs for a discussion as to comparison between the two. So when we talk about the nature of scheme, new pension scheme has defined contribution, but old pension scheme had defined benefits. While when you join the services, you already know what are the kinds of benefits you are going to get at the time of retirement, which is subject only to the latest pay commission. When it talk about contribution, new pension scheme had contribution both from the government and employee, whereas in old pension scheme, all the contribution came purely from the government. As far as benefit is concerned, we have understood there is no defined benefit as the accumulated wealth depends upon the contributions made. When we talk about old pension scheme, it had defined benefit, pension of 50% of the last drawn salary. When we talk about new pension schemes, pension amount, it depends upon the number of years of service. Longer the service of year, higher the contribution, higher the pension. Whereas in old pension scheme, it depends upon the last drawn salary and it had to be 50% of the last drawn salary. So this much discussion is sufficient to understand not only the national pension scheme but also the comparison between old pension scheme and new pension scheme. Let us now move on to the next article. So this last article for today appears on regional page, where the Chief Minister of Bihar, Mr. Nitish Kumar, has said that those who oppose Gandhi's principles are not Indians, and he was talking in relation to liquor consumption as a sin. And so, of course, philosophies of Gandhiji are worth repeating. So, for the lack of time, we are not going to discuss these philosophies in detail, but nonetheless, you are going to read them in various courses, in various books. For example, NCERTs are the best source to understand almost all of these philosophies, but it is important to have them at a particular screenshot at one location, so that when you have to write an essay on Gandhiji, which is one of the most frequently asked topics, you might be able to recall all of them together. So, the principle of Sarvodaya through Antyodaya. Sarvodaya means development of all, and Antyodaya means the welfare of the weakest one. So according to Gandhiji, the welfare of the weakest one is actually development of all. Then Gandhiji believed in the philosophy of trusteeship, because according to him, each businessman should take enough wealth to live honorably. He should distribute the remaining wealth back to the society, and trusteeship provides a means of transferring the present capitalist order of society into an egalitarian one. Then all of us know NCERT books contain Gandhiji's talisman to resolve any particular ethical dilemma, to remember the last man standing. Then the focus on weak and vulnerable, Antyodaya. Then Gandhiji believed in Lokniti over Rajniti, because Rajniti is the politics for power, whereas in contrast, Lokniti is the exercise of the power for the benefit of the people, for the empowerment of the people. Then Gandhiji always emphasized on duties over rights. Then Gandhiji envisaged 7 sins: wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce or business without morality or ethics, science without humanity, religion without sacrifice, and politics without principles. These are going to be extremely helpful in your ethics paper. Then Gandhiji said, politics bereft of religion is absolute dirt, ever to be shunned. He said that for me there is no politics without religion, not the religion of superstition and the blind religion that hates and fight, but the universal religion of tolerance. Politics without morality is a thing to be avoided. And as per Mahatma Gandhi, anger and intolerance are the enemies of correct understanding. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Let's now move on to the question of the day.